In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Let's do that again. You can do better. Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Today's the second Sunday after Pentecost. If you were here last week or watched the archived services, you'll know that we had first Sunday after Pentecost, and we celebrated the doctrine of the Trinity. And Father Hurst gave us a nifty little sermon about that. We're at the second Sunday now, and it's also actually the real beginning of that long church season we call ordinary time. It's half a calendar year, half of the church year. 26 weeks, and ending with the first Sunday of Advent, which is either in late November or early December. And it's ordinary time in the sense that these weeks fall outside the two great church seasons of the church year, Advent and Christmas, and Lent and Easter. We'll be hearing great stories from several books of the Old Testament, and we'll also be hearing various letters written by Paul. This morning we heard a portion of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. And we'll be hearing from the Gospel according to Mark, and to a lesser extent from the Gospel according to John. And we'll be hearing stories about Jesus and his ministry, which are lessons for us on how to be better disciples. But today, I want to focus on that Old Testament reading we heard, the first lesson. It's a terrific story. It's from 1 Samuel, the 3rd chapter. It's a well-known story, and it's about the calling of a boy, Samuel, to be a prophet. And it's appropriate that we hear about Samuel this morning because our baptismal candidate, Cora, is here this morning. She's awaiting baptism. So, Cora, later in my sermon, I'm going to talk about baptism. So you need to listen up. Yeah. Yeah. I think it'll be helpful for a deeper understanding of our first reading from 1 Samuel if we review first some of the background to the calling of Samuel, an overview of the first two chapters of the book of Samuel, because there's a lot of baggage going on. As the book of 1 Samuel begins, we are told of Elkanah and his two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah has borne children, but Hannah is barren. Peninnah harasses Hannah for her barrenness. Once a year, when the family goes up to the temple of the Lord at Shiloh to make the yearly offering, Hannah fervently prays for a son. But the prayers are to no avail. Until now. On this yearly visit, Hannah prays so fervently for a son, her lips are moving but there's no sound, that the old priest at Shiloh, Eli, he thinks she's drunk. And so Eli, the priest, derides her, but Hannah explains, I'm not drunk. I'm begging the Lord for a son. Eli, the priest, believes her and further predicts that God will grant her request for a son. And in time, Hannah indeed conceives and gives birth to a son whom she names Samuel, which means God hears. But then, of all things, at least in our minds, Hannah decides to return her son to the Lord as a gesture of gratitude. Hannah says, as soon as the child is weaned, which is about at 3 months, I will bring him to the temple at Shiloh, that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and abide there forever. Now, while Hannah's decision probably is not one you and I would consider, it is consistent with the theology, spiritual theology of the Old Testament. That is, that divine grace, once received, should be given away as a gift, thereby resulting in an even greater outpouring of grace. Now, this practice may seem strange to us, but it was common at the time. Also, Hannah's promise may appear rash, but the dedication of her son to the Lord has a parallel in our own Christian sacrament of baptism. Because in baptism, we confirm God's blessing and call upon the life of a child to follow Jesus. We affirm, just as Hannah does, that our children do not ultimately belong to us, but are given to us by God. Over time, children have the ability to develop their own relationship with God. Now, continuing this brief background to the calling of Samuel, two sons of the priest Eli are also priests, serving with him at Shiloh. These two sons are described as worthless and abusive. But Eli takes no action against them. True, he chews them out, but no disciplinary action is taken against them. So, as we come to our reading now from 1 Samuel, is it any wonder that our first reading begins with these words? The word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. We're told that Samuel is ministering, that is, being mentored at the holy place at Shiloh by Eli. It's evening and they have gone to bed, and sometime in the night Samuel hears a voice, "Samuel, Samuel." Thinking the voice is that of Eli, he goes to Eli and says to Eli, "Well, here I am." But Eli denies that he is called Samuel. After this, the call, "Samuel, Samuel," occurs 2 more times. Eli finally understands what is happening and tells Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears.'" And it's at this point the Lord does speak again, and this time Samuel listens. There is much symbolism in this story. Eli's fading eyesight is symbolic of his fading spiritual vision. He cannot lead. He can't even control the behavior of his 2 priest sons in the holy place at Shiloh, the very place that he's in charge of. Continuing the symbolism, we're told that in the temple at Shiloh are 2 symbols of the divine presence of God. First, a lamp whose flame, like the famous story of the burning bush, symbolizes God's presence. And the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant, believed to be the most sacred religious object of the Israelites. Despite the rarity of the word and little spiritual vision, these 2 symbols of the divine presence remain. God has not been extinguished. They're there as 2 symbols of hope. Great storytelling about the call of a boy to be a prophet in a dark time in the history of Israel. So what can you and I take from this story in our own time and place? Will share with you 2, and there are many more, and maybe you will think of many of them. First, this story, the calling of Samuel to be a prophet, teaches us that it is possible to hear God's voice without recognizing it as God's voice. Samuel, probably around 12 years old in the story, did not yet have the personal awareness of God that throughout the Old Testament is called knowing the Lord. Just as a sidebar to this sermon, there's a Christian parallel which is sometimes heard. Do you know Jesus? The voice that Samuel hears, it must be familiar, because Samuel doesn't respond by saying, "Well, who's there?" Or when he comes over to Eli, he doesn't say, "I heard a voice, was it you?" No. Samuel simply goes over after he hears the voice to Eli and he says, "Here I am, for you, Eli, called me." The point is this: what Samuel has learned of the Lord up to now has been taught to him by Eli, his mentor. And it's all he knows. Samuel cannot yet hear the difference between the voice of Eli and the voice of the Lord. But let's give Eli some credit. he finally realizes that it is God calling Samuel. So he directs Samuel. Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears. As parents, friends, and mentors of our children, as our children grow beyond their earliest years, we then need to help them to go beyond us ourselves so that they can come to know God in their own right, so they themselves can hear the voice of God. Second, our reading from 1 Samuel is set in a dark time for the Israelites. Again, from that reading, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. How would the writer of the book of 1 Samuel characterize our times? Let me quote one contemporary writer, David Runcorn, quote, "What is a world like in which God seems to have withdrawn from sight and sound? Does it all go eerily silent? Quite probably it is noisier than ever. When God goes silent, we do not hear nothing, we hear everything. There is nothing to give us a focus or a perspective, so we are left at the mercy of chaotic, conflicting, competing messages with no way of discerning any priority or meaning in it. In the time of the call of Samuel, the people did not see nor did they hear the sound of their God. So we might ask ourselves in our time, is too much of what is happening in our time being interpreted through just a political lens? And are there too many self-described expert bobblehead commentators about? If you know people in our time who cannot see nor cannot hear the voice of God, then invite them to Church of the Redeemer. Better, bring them. At Redeemer, you will hear the voice of God in our Bible readings, our music, our liturgy, and in our various ministries. Now, our reading in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel ended at verse 10. Verses 11 and 20 are given as an option. That's an error. They need to be read. I'm going to read them to you because they tell us what happens after Samuel. The first thing Samuel does as a prophet. You may remember the 10th verse ended this way. The Lord came and stood forth, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for thy servant hears. Beginning at verse 11. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the two ears of everyone that hears it will tingle. On that day, I will turn against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I tell him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. And Eli said, Well, what was it that God told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, where the Lord revealed himself to Samuel by the word of the Lord. Hear what that boy, Samuel, said as a prophet of God. Through him, the people did hear the voice of God. and all of their ears tingled. Amen.